Today's video is all about food webs. Food webs might be something that you might have done in a younger elementary grade. In 8th grade, we are going to take it and we're going to actually build upon basic ideas to more complicated ideas. And so let's take a look at this image here. This image is going to share and showcase what this video is going to overview. I'm going to go through the 3 levels of food webs, and we're going to help you build a food web as we go. So let's dive in and check it out. For level 1, we are going to focus in on basic relationships and really think about the phrase, follow the flow of the energy. And the arrow is going to serve a very big part of that as we think about these basic relationships and where different objects get their energy from. When we think about following the flow of the energy, we need to really think where each one of these items on the page get their energy from. So, we've got sun, bark, bananas, termite, and chimpanzee. Our energy flow is going to be represented by an arrow. The arrow is going to go to the thing that gets the energy. Okay. With that, we are going to look at each item individually as to where they get their energy from. If we look at the bark first, we need to think about where does the bark get its energy from. Well, trees get their energy from the sun, and bark is part of a tree, so therefore the main source of energy is going to be from the sun. So I'm going to draw an arrow going from the sun to the bark. Then I'm going to move on to my next object. My other object here is bananas. Well, bananas don't have mouths either, so they must be a producer. And so producers get their energy from the sun because bananas are part of a plant. So I am going to draw another arrow from the sun to the bananas because that is the way that it receives its energy. Moving on to our next object, the termite. Where does the termite get energy from? Well, if I needed to look it up, I could, but I do know that termites eat wood, and so the only object on our food web we have right now is a picture of bark, and so I'm going to draw an arrow going from bark to the termite. And that will then move me over to our chimpanzee. Our chimpanzee actually gets energy from a lot of different things that are on this page because it is the focus animal of our food web here. And so we know that chimpanzees eat termites, we know that chimpanzees eat bark, and we know that chimpanzees also eat bananas. So I'm going to have 3 arrows going to the chimpanzee because that is where it gets energy from. The arrow goes to the thing that and shows the flow of energy around the ecosystem. Our second level, or level 2 of our food web, is all about identifying specific types of eaters, or to be more scientific, consumers and producers. Now let's think for a second about types of producers and consumers that you are familiar with. Some very common phrases to explain types of consumers are herbivore, which only eat plants, omnivore, which eat plants and meat, and carnivore, which mainly exclusively gets their energy from meat. So let's take a look back at our food web and see if we can start to identify some of those by looking at the arrows. The one last thing is producers, though. Producers, we can't leave them out. Producers get their energy from the sun, so exclusively they are plants. And so anything that's a plant in our food web is going to be labeled a producer. And then anything that has a mouth or can consume their energy by putting things into their mouth would be one of these type of consumers. So let's take a look back at our food web and our arrows and see if we can figure out this first round of labeling. Since we already have our arrows on our food web, it's going to be quite easy for us to put this first round of labels on. When we look here, we look at each item individually, we just need to see where it gets its energy from, and that will help us to figure out what type of consumer it is. So let's first look at bark. Where did it get its energy from? It got its energy from the sun, and so did the bananas. So we are going to label them as producers. Next, I'm going to move on to the termite. The termite gets its energy from a plant, so the termite would be an example of a herbivore. Lastly, I'm going to look at the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee has arrows from producers and an arrow from a herbivore, so a chimpanzee must be considered an omnivore. Now, as we move through this last cycle, or the second cycle of labeling, what we need to add in here is the last thing, or one of the most important components of a food web that keeps the energy cycling through, and that is a decomposer. So I've added a picture of a worm because worms are a type of decomposer. Now, we also need to add in some arrows. Like I said, decomposers are very important in breaking down matter, living matter on Earth that has died. So we are going to draw an arrow that goes to the decomposers from anything on this food web that is on Earth that can die. So the chimpanzee is living on Earth and can die. Bananas can be broken down and decomposed, as well as bark, and so can the termites. In our last level of food web, level 3, we're going to be thinking about classifying the consumers. We're going to leave the producers alone. The producers are not going to get any more labels, but we're going to add one more label to the different types of consumers. Therefore, it creates a sort of status between the different types of consumers in our food web. Our first type of consumer is considered a primary consumer. They are a lower level consumer and they mainly get their energy from plants. Therefore, anything that's labeled a herbivore can have an added label of primary consumer. Our next type of consumer is considered to be a secondary consumer, and they're a little bit higher up on the food web scale because they get their energy not only from plants, but from plants and animals. So therefore, anything that we have labeled as an omnivore will get a label of secondary consumer in our level 3 food web. The last and highest status of consumer in our food web is going to be a tertiary consumer. A tertiary consumer is the top level predator, and there can be only one tertiary consumer in a food web. That is the one that nothing else in the food web is going to be consuming. So let's take a look back at our food web and see if we can start to work in this last level of labels. In this last level, we are just adding one more layer to show our thorough knowledge of what we have created. And so when we're classifying different consumers, producers need no other labels because that is what they are. They get their energy from the sun. Now, a herbivore, we can add another label too. When we think about a herbivore, we are going to add in the label of a primary consumer because it mainly consumes plants. Now we have a decision to make for our second part because our chimpanzee consumes both producers and it also consumes herbivores. And so in that case, it would lend itself to be a secondary consumer. But if we wanted to make our food web a bit more complex and have that last or higher level of a tertiary consumer, we would need to add in another photo into our food web, something that gets energy from a chimpanzee. And so we are going to add in a photo of human because humans actually hunt chimpanzees and use them for what they call in Africa bushmeat. And it's one of the reasons why chimpanzees is on the endangered list. So you can see here that I've gone through and added a label of secondary consumer to chimpanzees and tertiary consumer to human. The last thing I need to do here, since I have added another element into our food web, is draw an arrow going from chimpanzees to humans, and then from humans down to decomposers. And that wraps up our food web. It might look a little messy, it might look a little crazy, but if you just simply break it down and follow the arrows, you can start to see the flow of energy in the ecosystem and how everything is connected.